Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on realignment, religion, and the conservative coalition. The core question is this: what do citizens do when they fear government misconduct, resent rising prices, dislike cultural change, and still want someone to restore order? The core competency is to cite examples of Americans shifting political, economic, and religious values after 1968. What do citizens do when they fear government misconduct, resent rising prices, dislike cultural change, and still want someone to restore order? That is the working problem behind conservative realignment after 1968. The answer was not a sudden national conversion or a clean ideological awakening. It was a hard political assembly job built from distrust, inflation, racial backlash, suburban tax anger, evangelical organizing, and a new language of selective anti-government politics. The old New Deal coalition had already been under pressure before Ronald Reagan took office. Civil rights legislation pushed many white Southern voters away from the Democratic Party. Urban unrest, school busing fights, and crime politics sharpened suburban fear. Vietnam discredited official competence. Watergate discredited executive restraint. Then the 1970s delivered something voters could feel in the grocery aisle, at the gas pump, and in the mortgage office. Inflation eroded wages, oil shocks exposed dependency, and unemployment stayed painful enough to make economic expertise look weak. A coalition does not form because a public suddenly loves theory. It forms because existing institutions look unable to hold together daily life. Conservative ascendancy came from a political bargain. Business conservatives wanted lower tax burdens, lighter regulation, and friendlier treatment of capital. Sunbelt suburban voters wanted relief from property taxes, busing orders, and a federal state they associated with waste or social disorder. White Southerners wanted a party that would speak against federal intervention without openly restoring the language of segregation. Evangelical organizers wanted abortion, school prayer, sexuality, and family authority brought into electoral combat. Anti-communist hawks wanted military confidence after Vietnam. These groups did not enter politics carrying one shared doctrine. They learned to campaign through one shared accusation. Washington had become expensive, intrusive, morally unreliable, and weak where strength was demanded. That makes the civic problem sharper than the easy slogan. When politicians say government is the problem, which government do they mean? Rights enforcement, welfare administration, tax collection, environmental regulation, judicial decisions, or the presidency that lied about war and abused its office. Conservative realignment worked because it collapsed those distinctions in public argument while preserving them in actual governance. The rhetoric sounded like retreat from the state. The practice turned into a different use of the state. The world before Reagan was not a settled liberal order cruising toward normal reform. It was an administrative system hit from several sides at once. Lyndon Johnson had tried to pursue the Great Society and the Vietnam War together, which strained budgets, credibility, and political patience. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 changed the moral structure of federal power and also changed party geography. Once the National Democratic Party became more identified with civil rights enforcement, many white conservatives in the South began a longer drift toward Republican presidential politics that Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign previewed and Richard Nixon's Southern strategy developed. Nixon's rise showed how effectively disorder could be translated into coded appeals about law, order, and silent majorities. Yet the administration that promised restoration became a tutorial in institutional abuse. Watergate exposed campaign finance schemes, obstruction of justice, illegal intelligence activity, hush money, executive secrecy, and a White House willing to treat agencies as tools of self-protection. Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, after release of the smoking gun tape made impeachment and conviction nearly unavoidable. Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon in September 1974 may have been defensible as a stability measure, but many citizens heard it as elite closure. The message was brutal. Institutions could demand obedience from ordinary people while protecting their own. Economic pressure then compounded the legitimacy crisis. The Bretton Woods dollar-gold system had already cracked in the early 1970s. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 and the Iranian Revolution of 1979 pushed energy insecurity into everyday life. OPEC price shocks produced gas lines, rationing schemes, and a public sense that national leadership could not control basic supply. Inflation climbed into the double digits. By 1980, the consumer price index rose more than 13%. Mortgage interest rates moved toward punishing levels. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker responded in 1979 with tight money policy that drove the federal funds rate sharply upward and forced a recession. That policy eventually helped break inflation, but it also deepened the pain in factories, farms, and credit markets. Cultural conflict made the economic crisis more combustible. Roe v. Wade in 1973 nationalized abortion conflict. The Equal Rights Amendment sparked organizing for and against feminist change. School desegregation orders and metropolitan busing plans pushed race and federal authority into suburban politics. The Supreme Court's decisions on school prayer and public morality gave conservative Christians a durable list of grievances. These were not separate storms. They touched the same electorate that was already angry about taxes, prices, crime, and distrust. Alternatives did exist. Jimmy Carter tried a politics of honesty, administrative reform, and energy discipline. He backed deregulation in airlines, trucking, and finance, in part because older regulatory systems had become rigid and cartel-like. He created the Department of Energy in 1977 and treated oil dependence as a structural weakness. His July 1979 address on confidence argued that the crisis reached beyond fuel prices into national purpose. The difficulty was political mechanics. Telling voters that sacrifice is necessary works poorly when the state looks unable to deliver control, relief, or trust. The conservative coalition became durable because it built institutions equal to its anger. Start with the tax revolt. California's Proposition 13, passed in June 1978, capped property tax rates at 1% of assessed value and limited future assessment increases until sale. The technical design made the politics portable. A homeowner did not need a seminar in ideology. The yearly bill itself taught the lesson. Inflation drove property values upward. Local assessments followed, and suburban families felt government as a recurring extraction. Proposition 13 turned tax resentment into a governing model, then spread that language nationally. Business organizations were building alongside that mood. The Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, corporate PACs, and donor networks expanded lobbying capacity. Think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation translated complaint into policy schedules, agency blueprints, and legislative priorities. Conservative lawyers and business interests wanted judges, regulatory appointees, and tax provisions that would narrow labor power, weaken consumer regulation, and encourage investment. This was not mood alone. It was paper, staff, mailing lists, briefing books, testimony, and a hiring pipeline. The evangelical side of the coalition also ran on infrastructure. Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority, founded in 1979, used churches, televangelism, donor appeals, and voter guides to turn religious identity into partisan turnout. Paul Weyrich helped argue that conservative Christians needed durable political organization rather than private complaint. Abortion after Roe mobilized activists, and the story is larger than one case. Evangelical and fundamentalist activists reacted to school prayer rulings, sex education, the feminist movement, gay rights activism, and federal challenges to racially discriminatory private academies that had become segregation havens. The Internal Revenue Service's scrutiny of such schools angered religious conservatives who already believed Washington distrusted their institutions. A coalition survives when each partner hears its own grievance inside the same sentence. For business donors, the sentence was regulation and taxation. For white Southerners, it was federal overreach, neighborhood control, and resentment toward liberal elites. For evangelicals, it was moral disorder. For anti-communists, it was national weakness after Vietnam. The fall of Saigon in 1975, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and the Iranian hostage crisis. Reagan's talent was not inventing these grievances. It was making them sound compatible. Reagan also benefited from democratic fragmentation. Carter faced inflation, energy shocks, an agricultural squeeze, and the 404-day Iran hostage crisis. Ted Kennedy's primary challenge in 1980 weakened party unity. Labor remained important, but private sector union density was already under pressure from industrial restructuring and hostile employer tactics. Urban liberals, Southern conservatives who remained Democrats locally, Northern ethnic voters, Black voters organized labor, and Reform liberals did not hear the decade the same way. Republicans needed only enough overlap to assemble a majority. Once Reagan entered office in 1981, coalition language moved into statute. The Economic Recovery Tax Act cut marginal income tax rates over 3 years and lowered the top rate from 70% to 50%. Accelerated depreciation rules favored investment. Anti-regulatory appointments changed agency posture. Reagan fired more than 11,000 striking air traffic controllers in the Patco dispute of August 1981 after they defied a federal no-strike rule. That act reached far beyond one union. It signaled to employers, managers, and investors that federal power would back managerial discipline against organized labor when the confrontation was framed as legality and order. The contradiction at the center of the coalition remained visible. Conservative rhetoric condemned government as bloated and invasive. Conservative governance preserved or expanded state power where the coalition wanted it. Military buildup, anti-drug policing, border enforcement, tax code engineering, and judicial transformation. That is why the phrase small government misleads. The new right did not abolish federal power. It redistributed legitimacy among different uses of power. Regional change strengthened the same shift. Sunbelt growth in California, Texas, Arizona, Florida, and the suburban South increased congressional representation, donor influence, and media confidence in a politics built around low taxes, real estate development, defense spending, and anti-bureaucratic language. Deindustrializing northern cities, by contrast, carried the burden of plant closures, shrinking tax bases, and rising service demands. The coalition thus rested on both grievance and geography. Ronald Reagan's first inaugural address on January 20th, 1981 is famous for the line, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." The sentence is strategically unkind. Reagan turned public frustration into a total accusation against the governing class associated with the previous era. That sentence works because it arrives after Watergate, stagflation, oil shocks, recession, and the hostage crisis. It converts several distinct breakdowns into one enemy. A citizen angry at taxes, gas prices, urban disorder, paperwork, busing, and foreign humiliation can hear the line and believe that one cause sits behind all of them. That is tactical compression. It shortens a decade into a verdict. The source also reveals its tactical purpose because it was delivered at the moment Reagan assumed command of the same federal apparatus he condemned. He needed Congress to pass tax cuts. He needed cabinet departments to enforce his priorities. He needed the Treasury, Federal Reserve Coordination, the Pentagon, and the courts. When he praised the people and criticized Washington, he was drawing a moral boundary more than an institutional one. The line directs loyalty away from administrators identified with liberal governance and toward a president claiming to release the nation's natural energy. Short phrases do the heavy work. We have every right to dream heroic dreams. The economic ills we suffer have come upon us over several decades. It's time to check and reverse the growth of government. Each phrase places suffering, delay, and rescue into the same emotional rhythm. Reagan offers a story in which citizens are productive, government is burdensome, and renewal follows discipline. That story flatters the public while reorganizing expectations about what federal action should do. The inaugural is therefore a weapon against the memory of the New Deal state and the Great Society state without openly disowning every benefit those states produced. Reagan does not tell retirees to reject Social Security. He does not ask homeowners to reject federal mortgage systems or veterans to reject military spending. He attacks the forms of state action his coalition had learned to distrust. Social planning, regulatory expansion, redistributive language, and elite expertise that seemed unable to prevent crisis. Read that way, the address is less a philosophical statement than a coalition maintenance document. It reassures business conservatives, tax revolters, hawks, and religious voters that one administration can serve them all by naming the same adversary. The sentence survives because it did not need to be fully true. It needed to be politically useful. The conservative coalition changed American politics because it altered the default burden of proof. After Reagan, defenders of federal action had to explain themselves in a country where distrust of Washington had become ordinary common sense. Tax cutting became easier to sell than public investment. Regulation had to justify itself as if restraint were the natural baseline. Religious conservatives gained a durable position inside Republican electoral strategy. White Southern realignment accelerated. Business interests gained a political vocabulary that connected profit, freedom, and anti-bureaucratic grievance. The material results reached far past campaign rhetoric. Revenue debates shifted around tax cuts and deficits. Labor relations hardened as employers drew lessons from PATCO and from a wider anti-union climate. Military spending surged even as anti-state language remained central to conservative identity. Judicial appointments opened a slower path for reshaping abortion law, administrative power, and federal authority. The state did not shrink into irrelevance. It became more openly selective in what kinds of security and discipline it would finance. That is why the easy story about a conservative turn fails. The coalition operated as an answer to legitimacy collapse. It taught millions of voters to distrust some forms of federal power while expecting other forms to remain strong, moral, and efficient. The result was a republic still dependent on national administration, but increasingly unwilling to trust that administration unless it served a preferred moral and economic order.
The unresolved judgment is harder than choosing whether Reagan was right or wrong. If a democratic public has reason to distrust officials after Vietnam, Watergate, inflation, and bureaucratic failure, what keeps that distrust from becoming a permanent license for selective rule, where every faction condemns government in the abstract and then demands it in the fields it wants to control?
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.